It is my pleasure and privilege this morning to introduce to you Dr. Charles Hartshorne. If Alfred North Whitehead is the father of 20th century process theology, is it appropriate perhaps to regard Charles Hartshorne as its godfather? I think that's more than merely flippant. I think there are a couple of reasons why that is perhaps appropriate. The first of these is that Charles Hartshorne's investigations into the metaphysical thought, while deeply influenced by Whitehead's speculative vision, these investigations are already moving independently in a parallel direction before he spent 3 years at Harvard on a postdoctoral research fellowship 1925-1928 and spent part of that time as an assistant to Professor Whitehead. And so therefore it's inaccurate, you see, to designate Dr. Hartshorne as a second-generation proponent of a process mode of thinking, since in a very real sense he was already there at the beginning. But it is also true that Charles Hartshorne, more than any other thinker, has extended his inquiry into process conceptuality and the specific consideration of the God question, above all else. Whether identified under the rubric of panentheism, or dipolar theism, or a championing of the divine relativity, the latter the title of one of several dozen major works that he has written. Hartshorne's tireless efforts to represent fairly and perceptively the human vision of God have been brilliantly illuminating and consistently thought-provoking. I think it is also, however, appropriate perhaps to extend the metaphor beyond the Godfather imagery, to give equal time as it were, to regard him as well as midwife. And maybe that is even more appropriate. He remarked a few minutes ago in David Grant's class that there is a cultural lag in philosophy. I really enjoyed that. He said good ideas can be lying around for thousands of years before somebody notices them. And I think it is most appropriate to say of Charles Hartshorne that he has been midwife, helping give new birth to ancient concepts long ignored or misunderstood. So this morning we are graced with his presence in reflecting on an ancient concept to which he has given vital expression, the idea of dual transcendence, relationship between God and world. Dr. Hartshorne.
I may sit down after a while. Yes, I'm glad we have this. My voice probably wouldn't carry. My phrase, dual transcendence, is my invention, I believe. I don't think anyone else ever used it. But it has some relation to Whitehead's dipolarity of actual entities, including God. If I've just asked myself, how old is the basic idea, apart from the words? Well, I think that Plato could be said to have had it to a certain extent. Far more than Aristotle did, far more than Augustine or Thomas Aquinas did. But between Plato and Whitehead, there's quite a gap that I don't think anyone compares with either Plato or Whitehead between them in treatment of theology. That's a thought you couldn't have heard very often, I think. And I always like to find someone, though, who also had the idea, maybe even had it before I did in a sense. I had a student once who was a skeptical fellow, and he didn't quite know what he believed. He didn't believe me or Whitehead or Plato. But he got interested in my comparison of Plato's Timaeus and Whitehead, and he, I think, first said that he thought there's nothing between the two that compared with either. He didn't know that he believed either one, but he thought they surpassed everything in between. And I'm inclined to think that's right. That Whitehead's predecessor is Plato. Now, he partly knew this, but it's more true than he knew. Because Whitehead rejected Plato's idea that God is the soul of the universe, and the universe is the divine body. Whitehead rejected that. I think he was mistaken. If you have a psychophysical duality, then this applies to God too. And if you object to that, then I say, isn't the relation of the human mind to the human body so intimate that if you drop one of those two, you can't even have an analogy for the other side? Unless there's something analogous to body in God, there can't be anything analogous to the mind in us and in God. And to me, that's a strong argument. We better be careful of thinking we can make some sense out of a mind without a body. We certainly can't make much sense out of a human mind without a body. Ask any psychologist. I think almost any of them will say that. We have no idea what mind would be if they had no body. I don't think we do. And that doesn't mean I'm a materialist or even a dualist, because I interpret the body as a lower form of mind. Each little cell may have its own little feelings. I'm not very serious about that. And furthermore, Leibniz had a virtually similar idea long before I was anything at all. I've written an essay which has just been published, but I doubt if you've seen it. Has anybody seen the Tulane Studies in Philosophy, an article called Metaphysics and Dual Transcendence? Hold up your hand if you do. Well, I think I will read the first paragraph, since I was told I didn't need to prepare a formal lecture. The idea of God is a metaphysical idea. By this I mean that its definition employs only categories, concepts of strictly universal significance, claiming application to any and every conceivable existence. The defining characteristics distinguishing God from any other being, actual or conceivable, can be specified by such concepts. This is not true of any other individual being. God is individual, but not what is properly called a particular individual. Although some non-theists I could name, and some theists are not aware of this distinction. Theism, affirming the divine existence, is a universal, not a particular proposition. Proof. To say that God exists is to imply that anything there is or could be is divinely known as something that is or could be. Also, that its actuality or possibility is conditioned by divine creativity. Among existential statements asserting an individual existence, theism is uniquely universal. Argument about its validity is metaphysical argument. Then I go on to explain that by metaphysics I mean, as Aristotle and Kant both meant, statements about existence that are universal and necessary. So, if the statement that God exists is a metaphysical statement, then it's also a necessary statement. What that means is, not that we know for certain that God exists, but that to say that God does not exist is to say that God's existence is not even a possibility. What God cannot be is an accidental existence, something that just happens to exist. We just happen to exist. We might easily not have, very easily not have. And at any moment we might happen not to exist the next moment. But that's not the way you look at God. God is not an accident. The very existence of God is not an accident. Now, the divine transcendence, the duality of the divine transcendence comes in because although the existence of God is necessary, if you say that every truth about God is necessary, you're going to get into trouble. God knows that you and I exist. God is aware that God loves you and me. He couldn't do that if we didn't exist. If If our existence is accidental, then God's love for us as existing is accidental. So you cannot say that we are contingent accidents, but there's nothing contingent or accidental in God. If you say that, you're talking nonsense. For 2,000 years, theology talked that nonsense. Now, it's just too bad, but I'm afraid it's a fact. I'm not inventing this. There are lots of neo-Thomists who've come to see this too. Some of the very people steeped in that tradition have come to see this. I didn't have to discover it. It's been known for centuries. They did not talk sense. Of course, they said we can't talk sense about God. It's beyond our comprehension. All right, but then unless you say some sensible things about God, why talk at all? Funny, there have always been people who say, well, it can't be said, but then they go on and keep trying to say it. Our human concepts are our responsibility. They're our concepts. We invented them. The element of Greek philosophy that runs through classical theism, that's an invention of the Greeks. That's not a divine invention. That isn't the word of God. Now, one way to look at this is there are two dangers. In any theology, you have to look out for two opposite dangers. One is that you're going to make God too much like a human being, or as Matthew Arnold said, a magnified, non-natural man, bearded creature up in the sky. I never had that image that I can remember. I don't think my father ever had it. He was an Episcopal minister. But some people apparently have had that image, kind of a did. My first image I can remember for God was a light, literally a light, like the sun or something, which I also thought was love. I somehow put those together. That's the earliest image I can remember. Can't remember the man-like image. So that's one danger. You're going to make God too much like a man. But the opposite danger is just as great and just as real. In trying to escape the danger of too much human meaning, too much man-like, human-like meanings, and the idea of God, we may fall into the opposite danger of no meaning at all. God is the great nothing. They said, they boasted we have a negative theology because human concepts are inadequate to God, so we have to negate them all. Well, why not just say God is nothing? Then can you worship nothing? And can you say that nothing loves us? What do you mean if you say that? You know, Buddhism, that's the mystery about Buddhism. They say non-being is superior to being somehow. But they never really explain how that makes sense. So we have these two opposite dangers. That you deprive the idea of God of any meaning, or you make it, you give it an anthropomorphic meaning, a viciously anthropomorphic meaning. If you're vindictive, your God will be vindictive. You can see that too. If you're warlike, God will be warlike, etc. Maybe God isn't warlike at all. I suspect not. Or you will think of God as the great punisher. I am committed to the proposition God doesn't punish anybody. That's what I think of the doctrine of hell. And there, as in so many other things, I have predecessors. Whiteheadian said it. He said that was the most disgusting morality ever conceived. We can't be stronger than that. I don't think God is rewarding. I don't think God is punishing. I think God is a loving being. I don't think he hates anybody. So now, how does this lead us to dual transcendence? Well, in order to make clear that God was not just a magnified human being, they said, well, God is absolute, and human beings are relative, dependent, God is necessary, exists necessarily, we exist contingently. God is infinite, we are finite. There's a long list of these. Absolute, infinite. They also said God is simple, we're complicated. We have billions of cells, that's very complicated. God is simple. They failed to ask, how can the simple include or comprehend the complex? The merely simple cannot include the complex. That's a clear proposition of logic. And it's a perfectly undisputed axiom, truism of modal logic, that the necessary cannot include any contingent elements. So if we're contingent, and knowledge of us must be contingent, then there can't be any knowledge of us in God. They never wrestled with that. There has to be contingency in God, or God can't know us. Because if we are contingent. Spinoza got out of it by saying, well, we're not contingent, nothing is contingent, everything is necessary. But hardly any theologians defend that. So now you have this list of absolute, infinite, simple, self-sufficient was another expression. There are a good many other. Active, God is active. God acts on all things, nothing acts on God. God is not passive in any relation. Now, dual transcendence simply says God is both absolute and relative. And by being absolute, that certainly distinguishes God from us. By being independent, that certainly distinguishes God from us. So now then they would say, but if you say that God is also dependent, God is also relative, God is also finite, then how do you distinguish God from us? Well, the answer to that was given in part by Plato 25 centuries ago. What is it? Something like that. And since then, theologians haven't paid much attention to this aspect of Plato. Plato said that the universe is God's body. Now, is the universe infinite? Well, the Greeks didn't think so, and I think they were right. The universe is spatially finite, and that still holds that most physicists, I think, would prefer to think of it that way. They don't feel that they can prove it. But I'm inclined to say that it's bad metaphysics to suppose that the world is spatially infinite. That means the world has no definite character at all. Only the finite has a definite character. The absolutely infinite is formless. And they admitted that. They'd said God is formless. Well, so much the worse for God, I think. If God has a knowledge of me, that's a definite formal element in God. Well, the Dickens could it not be? How can you have wholly indefinite knowledge of definite things? I don't think you can. I think the knowledge of a finite world is itself finite. It's the knowledge of that world, not of some other world, which there might have been but isn't, which isn't there to know. So you have to have a unique way in which God can be relative. We're relative, but actually we're much more than relative. You or I are tiny fragments of the whole universe. Now the whole universe is also relative, it's also finite. But the whole universe is not fragmentary, it's not a fragment. But we are, each of us is just a fragment. And a very dependent fragment. And each of us has an external environment that acts on us. God has no external environment. Plato was perfectly clear about this. God is unique because this is the individual with no external environment. If God interacts with us, it's like us interacting with our brain cells. Not just with our body, but with the part of our body that we're most intimately related to. That's the nervous system. Greeks didn't know about nervous systems. There were a lot of things they didn't know. I think it's a great mistake to try to find all wisdom in the Greeks. They didn't have it. They couldn't have it. The things we know, they didn't. A lot of people talk as though, it's all the same old stuff. Not true. There are important differences. We know some important things they didn't know. We know that we are vast, that we, include mind and body, are vast social system on many levels. Particles, atoms, molecules, cells. Huge, complicated thing. They didn't know that. Hardly knew a thing about it. They believed, some of them believed in atoms, but they couldn't prove it. We can prove it, I think. We know there's cells. Why pretend we don't know that? So, I put two lists here. You see a double list, absolute, self-sufficient, infinite, the long list, and the relative, dependent, finite, the long list on both sides. There's also subject-object. What's the relation of a subject to its object? Now, you have these two sides. God is in a unique way finite, in a unique way dependent, in a unique way not self-sufficient. Now, on the absolute side, another term was eternal. And they meant immutable, unborn, undying, and not even changing. Now, there is a side of God that is unborn, undying, and not even changing. If there's any definite perfection in God, any definite ethical righteousness, let's say, take the term righteous, if God is in some sense absolutely righteous, that must be an unchanging God. Nobody wants to say, or very few have ever wanted to say that God is first mildly good and partly good, partly bad, and then he gets better and better and finally gets wholly good. And Plato was clear about that. He thought that God was wholly good and willed only good. He thought that evil was not a deliberate factor that God introduces the world, decides, well, let's be murderers and so on, exactly this murder and that murder. No such thing in Plato. And yet, in medieval theology, it's not clear whether they're saying that or not saying it. They're at best ambiguous, and worst, just bad. I think God made it up, decided to be that murderer, just that murder. And he would suffer exactly this much. So-and-so would suffer nothing like that in Plato, and I think it's all to the good of Plato. Then how does evil come? Well, now you have to decide if God is supreme freedom, what is a creature going to be? Not supreme freedom. What about lesser freedom? There's my freedom now as an adult, and that's more than the freedom of a small child. And does a fetus have any freedom? Certainly not much. Does a fish have any freedom? Well, now there you have to decide. Are you going to have a dualism, a sharp, absolute dualism, that God is free, you and I have some freedom, but sticks and stones have no freedom, atoms have no freedom. But at that point, there was one Greek and one Roman follower, Lucretius. There was Epicurus and Lucretius. They believed that even atoms have a little freedom. Now, that idea was around for more than 2,000 years, but nobody took it up. Nobody. They call this the cultural lag in philosophy. Nobody took it up. Epicurus believed that he was free, but he also believed that the soul consists of atoms. So his atoms have to have some freedom somehow. So he attributed freedom even to the atoms. That's a bizarre idea. It's presented as a bizarre idea in Epicurus. And for 2,000 years, that's all it was, a bizarre idea. Along came Peirce, Charles Peirce, great American intellect, perhaps the greatest intellect we had in the 19th century, along with Willard Gibbs. I'd be curious, how many have heard of Willard Gibbs? Few. Probably the greatest intellect besides Peirce in the 19th century in this country, greatest scientific or philosophical intellect. Well, anyway, along came Peirce. Peirce didn't have much philosophy as an undergraduate. He studied chemistry and got a degree with honor. But and afterwards, after he finished his college work, he got into the question of philosophy and he began to read Greek philosophy. He did have a course in Greek, he knew Greek. So he read Greek philosophers. And he read this in Epicurus about the freedom of atoms. And he looked at this as a chemist and a physicist. That's the way his training was. And he wondered, now, what would a contemporary scientist say about this? The more he thought about it, the more he thought it was a good idea. It was probably true. But the behavior of atoms probably was not according to any rigid regular rules or any rigid regularity. And I don't know whether Peirce knew it, but Clerk Maxwell, some would say the great physicist of the 19th century, the one in the world, like a Newton later century. Clerk Maxwell. I found 3 places. I looked this up because I knew he was a contemporary person. I wondered about that. And I've never found out whether the person knew about Maxwell much. It seems he must have, because he kept up with things pretty well. And anyhow, there are 3 places in Maxwell's collected works which strongly indicate that he was not a rigid causal determinist, that he believed that there was some randomness in nature, and he gives a couple of arguments about that. So, in the late 19th century, philosophy began to catch up to Epicurus. That's the way I look at this. That's not the way you'll find the history of philosophy. That's the way I see it. That idea, nobody took it seriously. And I don't boast that Clark Maxwell knew about that, the idea of Epicurus. But there, so then a lot later came Bergson and Whitehead. Well, Bergson and Peirce were almost contemporary, partly contemporary. Then came Bergson and Whitehead. William James followed Peirce. And Dewey took it up. So in American philosophy, has been basically a philosophy of freedom. This is not true of British philosophy. Political freedom, yes. But general philosophical, metaphysical freedom, no, you hardly get it from any British. It's very extraordinary. I've never quite understood this about the British. I think maybe there's something to do with the British Empire. But it's beginning in England now, quite recently beginning. Some idea that determinism, causal determinism, may be wrong. They're beginning to work. And Karl Popper, who's an Austrian who became a British Sir Popper, Sir Karl. He's very clear about this. He's not a determinist. So that's changed. So now you see you have God as supreme freedom and a creature as a non-supreme freedom. Now, come back to dual transcendence. God is unique by being absolute. Also unique by being relative in a unique way, a uniquely excellent way. Only God is independent in his very in existence. God exists no matter what. Nothing could alter the fact of God's existence. Nothing was needed to bring it about. God exists of himself. He is self-existent. God exists no matter what else. But the creatures exist only contingently, and in that sense, they are distinguished from God. So you have a being that exists necessarily, but has contingent properties, and a being beings whose very existence is contingent. So that distinguishes God from any creature in the same way. Now you can go through that list and you'll find a way in which God will be distinguished, will be unique in this dual fashion. Take the subject-object thing. Now some would say God is a subject that cannot be treated as an object. God is only subject. Now I say that's the same mistake. God is both subject and object. An object is just what some mind is taking as object. This is some mind as a world. So if we're aware of God, then God is an object. But there's a sense unique to God that God has an infinite future. God is immortal. We're immortal. So after we have died, we're merely objects then. They're no longer a new subject, as I interpret death. Well, this may shock some. But I want to tell you that Reinhold Niebuhr I would consider as high an authority as you can find on Christianity in this country, in this century. Much higher authority than Tillich. I knew both quite well. Niebuhr said to me about the view which I'm about to explain to you, that he was not sure that a Christian couldn't accept it. He said he preferred to leave it more of a mystery, not to try to rationalize it so far. The idea is, now here I'm simply following Whitehead, not adding a thing or subtracting a thing. Whitehead says we are objectively immortal because God cherishes us, and this divine cherishing of us and of all that we have been since we were born, that is an everlasting fact, a reality in God. God will never simply wipe that out, forget it, dismiss it. So forever after, you and I will have existed for God. Now, Niebuhr could, just like Niebuhr, he could see the point here. He could see that maybe that's what we should say as believers in God. Because, and if anybody says, oh, but that's God's immortality, not mine, then I simply remind you of the saying that you all have thought you accepted, that we ought to love God with all our minds, all our hearts, all our souls, all our strength. Now, if you take that seriously, really think what it means. How can you object if God's immortality is the only literal immortality in the non-objective sense? Only God goes on and on and on as a subject with constantly new experiences. That's what you're asking for if you're asked to go to heaven and just go on and on and on, enjoying things in heaven. It's God who will always go on and on enjoying things. Why must it be you? Well, this is a strange thing, but some people just can't bear the idea that someday they won't be only a has-been. I don't find that shocking at all. I never thought I was so important that I would have to go on and on being a subject with new states, new experiences. Please notice your life is not preservation you're asking for. Objective immortality gives you preservation. Complete, adequate knowledge and love entirely contains what it knows and loves. There's nothing left outside. The ideal love includes all that there is in the lover, in the loved. So I think I think it's very significant that Niebuhr thought that you couldn't object to that on the ground that it was necessarily incompatible with the belief in God. In general, I think Niebuhr was a very great man. I think anybody who knew him thought so. Extraordinary. He was the finest preacher to an intellectual or academic audience that I ever heard. I've heard some people do this. He was the best of them all. He was just extraordinary. So, is God immutable? Why must that be? Rajayev is one of the 20th century thinkers, an emigre Russian living in Paris. He was very emphatic about this. He thought the idea of God as immutable wouldn't do at all. Because he takes seriously the idea that there's an interaction between God and the creatures. If there's an interaction, what does it mean to say that God is in absolute sense immutable? How can an immutable interact with anything? How can we do anything to God? If we can't do anything to God, what does it mean to say we serve God? We can't give God anything. They boasted that God is so great that we can give him nothing. What's any good to him? Well, how does that how does that go with that we should serve God? We serve God, but he's beyond any service, possibly doing good work. I think it's an extraordinary lesson about the nature of human nature. That for thousands of years, that kind of paradox could be around and nobody did anything about it. But I do want to say, I've said this many times, there was one man who said long before Bajayef, long before Whitehead, long before me, about 1600, said, his name was Socinus, Faustus Socinus in Italy. He founded a sect, heretical sect, called Socinianism. He said there is change in God. That hadn't been said for 2,000 years or so. Aristotle didn't say it, or denied it. I read it into Plato. I think Plato thought so. What Plato really says is that the cosmic body, which is the divine body, does change, of course. But it changes in such a way that it's a moving image of eternity. They thought heaven circled around or something. So it's a nice, neat, circular motion change. Well, I think we can do better than that. There's the Greek idea that the circle is the most beautiful form. If that were the case, we could all be perfect artists, just draw circles. It's a childish aesthetics. They did not have a good aesthetics. It's another thing we know better. We know better what beauty is. On that I could talk a long time about that. It really is an aesthetics now. The Greeks didn't have a decent aesthetics. They talked about it. They knew there was a problem. Well, I don't know whether, how about some questions?
The floor is open to any of you for the next 20 minutes for questions that you want to express. Yes.
I wanted to ask, I was reading through Hans Kunigs's God Exists, and when he got to Feuerbach and he talked about projection, Kunig answered it in such a way as to say that Feuerbach had said, yes, you can't say no to God, but you can also say yes. He went on from there. Is there but that sort of leaves me kind of cold to respond to it that way. Can you respond to the Feuerbach description of projection and how that relates to God as a process?
Well, Feuerbach was one of the critics of classical theism. That's the only theism he knew. And you see, he made a choice. He couldn't make sense out of classical theism, except on the assumption that what people really meant by God was human nature idealized. And so you could, for instance, omniscience. Well, that's the ideal toward which our increasing knowledge tends, you see. All those things. And righteousness, goodness, well, we want to be righteous, more righteous, and so on.
You're not quite here.
Oh, yes. So Feuerbach developed one of the first forms of pure humanism in which he identifies God with humanity in its idealized capacities. As far as I've been able to make out, the poet Wallace Stevens, it's always been hard for me to see how he is a great poet, and I would never notice him. People didn't say he was a great poet. I've read and reread him, but I find it puzzling. However, he said once, I have substituted man for God. That's what Feuerbach did. But I see why he did it, because the theism he knew didn't make sense. That wasn't his fault. Wherever you find an atheist, I think you'll find a theologian who's made some mistakes. I think theology has a very heavy responsibility for most of the atheists. So I really do. But they had a hard job, and the Greek philosophy is the only philosophy they knew. And the Greek philosophy was limited by certain things. Forgot I was going to say something else. Sure,
We can go on to another question, and by that time you'll probably have remembered what it was.
Feuerbach seems to be the only fellow that the communists have on religion. About all they know about it. Yes.
I've recently been talking to somebody who is a student of EST, of Werner Erhard, just as how you say that. And he...
ESD.
EST.
Yes.
What's his name? Erhard?
Oh, I never heard.
Anyway, one of the ideas that he expresses is that does it make sense for us to talk about anything ultimate because it's just what we say, and that we should talk about ultimate reality, and that he's got a profound conviction that everything is ultimately meaningless, but that is just what he thinks, but his thinking that somehow frees him. And
frees him from what?
Well, I don't understand exactly that. But you mentioned something about the Eastern religions, the mystery that they leave is somehow not satisfactory for you.
For me.
Yeah, you said that it leaves that it goes to a certain question and then leaves that in the mystery, and that was not satisfactory.
Well, we're going to have mystery, whatever we say. There's no way of ratiocination can only accomplish certain things. But I agree with William James's pragmatism and with Schweitzer's argument that just to be alive is an affirmation. Living is affirmative and positive. That if you have a wholly negative philosophy, it contradicts the fact that you go on living. To say that life isn't the least worthwhile, yet you go on saying that, you go on living, you go on breathing. Your living contradicts what you're saying. I think life is an affirmation, and I'm absolutely committed to that. So I'm not interested in absolute pessimism. Charles Perstick was saying I don't think it's a live issue. The fact that you go on making any effort, whatever, contradicts what you're saying. Read Schopenhauer. He was the great negative philosopher in the West. He thought he was like the Buddhists, but the Buddhists are more ambiguous. They're not as pessimistic as he was in a certain way. But I agree with Schweitzer and William James. Unless you can live by the idea, really live by it, and show a rational connection between what you say you're committed to and you're going on living and how you live, then you're just talking. And I would say that fellow's just talking.
I would like to know how you get Jesus Christ with all this full transcendence.
Well, that's a natural question. That was a terrible problem for me. You see, my father's idea of God wasn't too far from the one I have now. He never had the classical theistic idea. He never did. Never was committed to the idea that God is immutable and so on, all those other one-sided ideas. But he did have a Christology. But that was for me a problem, and still is. It still is. In terms of human needs, there seems a tremendous need to have some human figure to focus on, not just think about God. And of course, the Muslims have Muhammad. They also say they allow Jesus as a prophet. But don't forget, the ancient Jews didn't have Jesus, and they certainly believed in God. And I think some of them believed in God and were more right than medieval theology was. Really. In some ways, I think the Jews have been right all along about some issues. But just some of my enthusiastic readers, some former students, have developed a Christology, and I've read several of those. They almost convinced me. But I have trouble with this, just how far you go, just how unique was Jesus. There's a sect of Hinduism that I came to know. I met two monks. One of them did a dissertation under me. He and I could communicate beautifully. We believed in God in the same sense, same general sense. But he didn't, I don't know what he thought about Jesus. I can't remember whether we ever discussed that. And the Orthodox Hindus, they all go back to Shankara. Always seems to have to be a human being. Well, I go back to Plato. But Jesus in the New Testament, I have some trouble with the fourth gospel, I suppose. And in some ways, Paul, the epistles of Paul, in some ways, they're absolutely glorious. We are members one of another. I take that to be a philosophical truism. But any good philosophy should be able to say that. But what Roy said about community, that's solid truth. But just how far you can go. I knew a Unitarian in the Divinity School of Harvard when I was a student. He was a lovely man. He was one of the most saintly theologians I've ever known. Some theologians strike one as saintly and some don't. But he did. He was a beautiful soul. Well, he would say Jesus is a symbol of God. And in our tradition, at least, the symbol. Well, I don't see any, I have no way of quality with that. But the parables of Jesus, I find make good sense to me. And when Jesus said that the sum of the law and the prophets was loving God with all your being and your neighbor as yourself, I said that's exactly what I believe. So that makes me a Christian. I'm simply a Christian. But if it has to be something more than that, I don't know. Just how I can do it.
Sure. Could you comment on Trinitarian thought and whether there is a need or a usefulness to such thought?
Well, this much. In classical theism, apart from the Trinity, God is just a cipher. Beautiful empty circle. What's in it you can't say. We can say what's not in it. Can't say what is it. Well, that won't really do. But I don't believe that the Trinity is also conceived in Greek terms much too much. Terms of the idea of substance, which is a pretty ambiguous idea, not very helpful. But, for instance, in us we distinguish self-love and love of others. Can you make that distinction with God? Now, I maintain that when you say that X loves X, you don't really mean that a certain something loves exactly that certain something. I'm convinced absolutely it does not make sense. If I love me, the me is not just the same as the I. I there refers to I now. But the me that's been there for quite a long while will be there tomorrow. If anyone loves that very person, that's not a sheer identity. The subject-object relation cannot be a sheer identity. The Hegelians talked as though it could be. I love myself as I was yesterday. I love myself as I may be tomorrow. But I now doesn't just love I now. That's nonsense. Yes. And so there must be such distinctions in God, and that's like the Trinity. And why did it says that? So the Trinity expressed the idea that persons could have internal relations to other persons. Yes?
I think it was Herrenberg that was talking about the possibility of projecting immortality, and it said that in a relational God, loving, I may not be quoting his line, but would recognize the unique love that he shared with the object of his love, and it could not explain how it would be that he felt that he had reason to hope for some reason of subjective immortality in addition to objectivity. Would you comment on that?
He could hope for it, but he didn't give a reason, is that it?
He said the reason was in the relationality of God and loving he and recognizing the uniqueness of the relationship that he held with his life, that it was hard for him to believe that a loving God would not have some opportunity, some form of subjective immortality for them in recognizing the relationship.
Well, I don't quite see it. Now, I want to make one distinction. Bergson inclined to believe in subjective immortality, but he finally said, I am not talking about infinite or prolongation. I'm not talking about infinity. In other words, he wanted a finite survival of death. Now, that's a different problem. I think that is harder to argue against. I'm not absolutely clear there's any overwhelming reason against that. But I don't see much reason for it either. You see, my view is that in ideal, a human life is a rounded thing. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have your genes give you certain opportunities in your situation. In taking those conditions into account, there's certain things you can do, but it's a limited thing that you can do. So with good luck and good management, you'll live longer if you don't smoke for one thing. That's damned important. Then you may live a rounded life, and you can also say, and independently, two of us at the same conference came out with this idea that a life ideally is a work like a work of art. Has a beginning, a middle, and an end, has a definite pattern. A work of art has an end. A symphony has an end, or so on. I think that a human life is sufficient unto itself under ideal conditions, and we can try to increase the number of cases where that takes place. I don't feel that I have an absolutely infinite task which ought to require an absolutely infinite ongoing for me to do it. I don't see it. I connect this problem with what seems rather different problem. You know, about old men constantly exchanging their wives of similar years to younger and younger, when I can't bear the thought that they can't go on being young and enjoying what it is to be young. So, I think this is just one of the subtle forms of egocentricity. So, now, if the idea was that all of life should come to an end and there's no divine life to go on, that's something entirely different. That to me is unacceptable. I don't see any sense in even trying to believe that. But it's an entirely different thing whether you have to go on. Somebody should have a young wife, but why must it be I? No, that's not a difficult thought for me. I don't have trouble with it. William James said he couldn't make up his mind between the two ideas about immortality, whether it was desirable or not. And it's not a man. I think I can make it. I see it in thought.
One last question from Glenn.
If we have time. On the theme of dual transcendence, your theme,
Yes.
you made a reference to a relative absence, at least, in British thinking about this subject, particularly freedom. My question to you, about William Temple wrote Nature, Man, and God, his gift of lectures, and it was on this theme. of dual transcendence. The first part was the transcendence of the immanent, and the second part was the immanence of the transcendent. Does your tape recall that theme in Temple?
I don't think that I knew Temple, by the way. I met him at about the time he'd already published that. I don't think that's dual transcendence. The immanence of the transcendent is not what I'm talking about.
It is not.
No. It's not that God is in the world. The point is the world is in God. That's the point. Bergiev says that too. I can find most of my ideas in somebody else. It's much more important to realize that the world is in God and to realize that, of course, God's in the world. The eternal has to be in the temporal. And the abstract has to be in the concrete, and the necessary has to be in the contingent. It's an absolute modal law that only the contingent can include the necessary. The necessary cannot include the contingent. So of course God's in the world if he's a necessary being. That's no problem. The question is whether the world is in God.
Yes, I understand it. And my question was, I think I can show you, we don't have time today, that there are affinities between your concept of dual transcendence and that of Archbishop William Temple.
Well, there probably are some. Oh, I want to say, you remind me of something. My father had in germ this whole business, and he got it from an Englishman who was teaching theology in an Episcopal seminary in this country. His name was Walpole. His son was a novelist that people were reading about 30 years ago. My father got a good grounding in something like process theology in the 1890s, about 1889, maybe something like that. So it was in England too, yes. Well, I thought that Temple was a moderately capable philosopher. I'll tell you something funny about Temple. You know, he wrote a book with two parts. The first part was philosophical, the second part was theological. And Wilhelm Pauck was a very amusing fellow. He said, well, in the first book, yes, he's a philosopher. Then in the second book, he puts on his gaiters. Bishop wears gaiters. Becomes a theologian. He amused himself talking about this.
You like that, huh?
I'll tell you what, I think that Temple was probably a valuable ecclesiastical statesman. Yeah. He did some of the right things.
Dr. Hartshorne, we want to thank you very much for your presence with us here this morning. I want to remind you all there are refreshments back in the back of the room. We are finite. Our time for the formal part of this session has ended. We thank you very much.